Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be tuning in from. This is now the first Industry Insights for 2021, Jason. 21. We made it. Hopefully, it's even better than 20. This is actually our 32nd Industry Insights that we've been doing now since world activities ensued. So, hope you're doing well, Jason. Hope you had a good break and ready to get back into it.
I'm always ready to spend time with you talking about what's right and wrong about the IT and data protection industry. So happy New Year to you, my friend.
Hey, happy New Year to you and to everyone else. Before we get going too far, if you are joining us live, and even if you're watching the replay, feel free to drop in a comment about where you might be tuning in from. We'll get back over to some of the countries or world map, as we like to refer to it as we go along. And right now you can see I am in Colorado. Jason is in Texas. We've got our producer Mark in Georgia, and our colleague Christian is in Romania. So we've got a little bit of a couple different continents going, but we'd like to see if we can light up a little bit more of that. So we'll come back to that, but also should mention, as always, that if you have any questions or comments while we're going along through this, feel free to drop that in as well. So invite you to be part of the conversation. And Jason, I'll let you tee up what we're going to talk about today, because in some ways, this is a continuation, meaning this style of research is something that we've been talking about for a little bit of time now, but now we've got even more current data in which to do it with.
Yeah, so right at the end, right before Christmas, Veeam wrapped up what will eventually be published as the Data Protection Trends Report for 2021. You got just a few more weeks. You got to wait before the rest of the data becomes public. But they did finish the survey work just before the holidays. And so Veeam actually surveyed over 3,000 organizations around the world. 28 countries, mostly enterprises, organizations over 1,000 employees. And we asked them about a lot of different things. Well, certainly, coming after the beginning of the pandemic, that certainly has changed a lot of IT strategies. So we were able to quickly add a few questions that weren't in last year's report on how is the pandemic affecting IT strategy. And we thought, what a great way to start off the streaming for this year is to actually kind of unpack a little bit of that data, and then maybe talk about, for the folks in the call today, what that might mean, what you ought to be thinking about from there.
Yeah, brilliant. And what I like about this is that these are fresh data points, as you mentioned. It is probably the largest survey in the industry of backup and recovery ever, not just for 2021, but literally, as far as we know, ever that's been undertaken. And what I think is very interesting to talk through, our topic is, as you can see below there, what's the impact of the pandemic or COVID on 2021 IT activity? And when we last ran the survey, we wrapped up data collection at essentially about 1 year ago. I mean, it was the end of January 2020. So for most of the world, COVID was really just starting to take hold in the very early stages, right? We didn't know a lot about it. Now here we are almost a year, full year later. And I think if we go to maybe our first slide, let's start to unpack this, because we asked a very simple question, which is, from a challenges perspective at a high level, what do you think in the next calendar year is going to be your most impactful or concerning challenge? And you can see we have the 2020 data below there in the lighter color, and in the darker color up top, we had the more recent 2021 data. So a lot to draw from here, Jason, but it's probably not surprising that economic uncertainty jumped to the top, given the kind of situation that many of us are still finding ourselves in.
Yeah, that's actually what I took away from that as well. So Dave, you bring up two really interesting things. So this is year over year data. And so there's kind of two nuances to that. One, the data sampling is about a year apart. So that's always interesting data to start finding out trajectory, right, where the gives and the takes are. And then also 2020's data is pre-COVID. 2021's data post-COVID, or I guess maybe mid-COVID is probably the more politically correct way to say that. But how do we look at those pivots? And yeah, should not come as a surprise to anybody. Economic uncertainty is top of mind. That's always one of the factors, but it's obviously bubbled up in the new normal that we have right now. I think the other thing which is really interesting is that there's the operational brass tacks of IT pretty much stay as is, right? So meeting customer change is roughly flat. Skill shortage in IT, roughly flat. Organizational leadership and how that supports digital transformation, roughly flat, right? Regulatory, roughly flat. Really, the only pivots are, economic uncertainty is big. And then cyber, I was a little surprised to see it go down. But again, this might be the case of I just got to keep the lights on and also hope that I don't have cyber. But mostly, I just got to keep the lights on.
Yeah, that's exactly how I interpreted it as well, meaning this is in no way, I think, a reflection of cyber threats, ransomware becoming less important. It's just that thankfully those things aren't happening to us every day. The threat is out there every single day, but these others like uncertainty, the customer demands, skill shortages, which are perennial top pollers, no matter if there's a pandemic or not.
Sure.
So I think to your point, this is a reflection of needing to focus on operationally, what do I have to do? Hopefully, what can I control or make an impact on? But if I were to put kind of a fine point on this, it's pretty obviously there's no number one clear winner. In other words, you can't just as an IT group say, okay, coming in for the rest of 2021, we're going to focus on one singular area, and that's going to give us the massive payback or eradicate our top challenges. The fact is we have a handful of challenges, some of which have been around for a long time, some of which have changed perhaps in importance, like economic uncertainty. But I'll toss it back to you to finish out this slide, and then maybe we'll take a look at the world map. But it's safe to say that the challenging job for IT in the data center remains challenging, and now we've just added a new wrinkle to it.
Yeah, in fact, probably the other way to look at it is look at those little red and pink lines at the bottom, right? So you could choose any of the greens, as many as you wanted, or you could choose, I have no challenges that'll affect my digital transformation initiatives, right? And last year, 16%, so 1 out of 6 said, I have no challenges, right? That means 5 out of 6 said they got at least one of the others. This year, only 12%. So that's a 25% reduction year over year as far as that goes, or arguably saying only 1 out of 8 organizations say, yep, no problems here. That means 7 out of 8 says, yeah, at least one of these is a problem for me. And I think that's the broader way to say that is, so in this case, let's just say 88% of organizations in 2021 anticipate at least one of these issues.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. And I know we've got a pretty major update I'm seeing on the world map. Let's take a look at that for a moment. I believe we have 18 more countries. So a couple of different places in Canada have popped in. But if we kind of look around the horn, we've got Ukraine, Spain, Romania, India, Panama, Brazil, South Africa. Both my favorite
mediators, Brazil and South Africa, are in the house.
Yeah.
A warm welcome to both of them from your meeting friends in Texas. Good job.
Exactly. Let's focus, on North America. Europe. I was remiss and jumped over some of the cities there. In Europe, we've got a number that have come into play as well. We've got France, we've got Czech Republic, UK, of course, Italy. Where else? I don't want to leave anyone out. I'm remiss not to do that. But
if you go down a little bit further south, we got Nigeria also checking in. We don't see them very often, so welcome to the broadcast.
Yeah, absolutely. South Africa, Nigeria. So I don't know if I mentioned Peru. I'm remiss if I didn't. So
look at Canada. I love when Canada piles on. Like a third of the map turns green. Makes me happy inside.
Yeah, and that's not just one location either. We've got Montreal, we've got Toronto in the house. So awesome. We'll come back, double click on that in a little bit. But why don't we unpack now? Let's get right to COVID-19 and what are the early effects and then what might be some of the sustained effects of the pandemic on IT coming into this year. We did ask a question about the early effects of the pandemic. And pretty good sample size, 2,800 global respondents, as Jason mentioned, over 28 countries, I believe. Mm-hmm. I'll steal some of your analysis punchline and then turn it over to you, Jason. But let's look at the converse, meaning as it relates to the pandemic and embracing cloud services, Only 1% said they have reduced their use of cloud services as a result of the pandemic. So, 99%, which I'll let you start to comment on, but only 1%. And, for all I know, that's a rounding error. That might be 0.59. So it's not certainly by any stretch a majority here.
Yeah. Okay. So 1%. So that's 28 out of the 280 or the 2,800 countries that are there. So and arguably, if you are a mid-sized to large enterprise, and all of a sudden someone said, "Stop every dollar you can," right? So you might scale back those things that are OpEx, because those are numbers that you can actually ratchet on a dime.
Right.
And then for the other 99% of organizations, what does that look like? Okay, so 8% neutral, right? So we'll take them out too. So that's 9 total. And then the other 91% of organizations in the first months of COVID increased their use of cloud. And I cannot say enough how happy I am with that. One, because I love data, right? Especially at scale. But two, we've been talking about this anecdotally for, starting in the summer, because we started hearing that, Dave, and your and I conversations with customers and also with vendors and partners, where folks said, look, I can't get in the data center, but I can't stop moving IT forward. The needs of the business continue, even if we're not in the building. Well, how do you solve for that? You light up cloud. Right. And what we're looking at here is it's not just they turned it on, 19% turned it on, 41% really stepped it up, and 31% said the cloud is our future. Right. Now, you can make the case that arguably what most of these organizations probably did is, if their IT modernization strategy already was going to go cloudy, what they did was they stomped on the gas. And then maybe they pulled nitro while they were at it. I mean, they just accelerated a plan they already had. My guess is most of those folks that were in the 8% and the 1% and maybe some of the 19, those fledgling ones, it's because they didn't have an IT modernization plan that wasn't data center dependent. And so what are you going to do when you can't get in the building, right? For everybody else, it was stomp on the gas and go cloudy.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned this before. I really like this notion. I didn't create this term, but the notion of a K-shaped recovery, meaning you think of the letter K, uppercase, as an upward dimension to it and a downward dimension to it. Thankfully, I would say the minority of organizations exhibited behavior similar to that downward notion of a K-shaped curve, meaning they tried to press pause. They tried to see if maybe this would be an issue that would sort of cleanse itself in a short matter of time, and it did not. They literally proverbially tried to weather the storm. The problem was, this is a protracted event. It's continuing to be protracted. If you're an optimist, hopefully you would say early in the first half of this calendar year, we find ourselves in a better situation related to the pandemic. If you're a pessimist to / perhaps realist, you're targeting probably more middle of the year to perhaps even into third quarter. So what that really means is, if you paused on cloud services early on, you may have missed an opportunity to engage in recovery or return to greater operations earlier on. And the fact that a third, basically at 31%, said they went harder faster, we significantly increased. I think what we would, if we could double click on the learning lesson, especially of the largest amount there, the 41%, we said that we moderately increased. All of the anecdotal conversations I've had, and I'd be curious of your thoughts on this, Jason, I have yet to speak to someone that says we went too soon or we went too much into embracing cloud services. I've only heard the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly heard some folks talk about their immediate triage. Now, by the way, I do a lot of work with scouting, right? And we teach first aid. And sometimes how you handle that wound in first aid is not a permanent solution, right? It's a mitigation. And so we have heard cases where someone said, I jumped on some cloud stuff just to keep running. That bought me a little time. And then I chose different cloud services, maybe a different provider, different services online as my long-term stretch. But I didn't hear anybody with remorse. It was just a matter of, did they press gas, or did they kind of, stop the initial wound, keep going so that they could do what they really needed to do smartly. So I just, before we leave that slide, if our producer Mark could just bring that up one more time. I do hope that y'all take a screenshot of this one. I hope you take it back to your teams and say, hey, how did we do this year? Where do we think we put on this? And we'd love to hear that in the chats afterwards. And Dave or I will respond to any comments on this. But we'd love to hear from the folks on that are on the line. How did you pivot on that before we go? So, all right, shall we go to the next data point, Dave?
Yeah, and you alluded to it, but let's put a finer point on it, meaning you couldn't get into the data center at certain portions of time in 2020. So from a hardware perspective, from an infrastructure viewpoint, that had major ramifications for some of us. And so we asked this pointed a question around the pandemic or COVID-19 and your hardware strategy. And I'll say two quick things, Jason. I mean, at first blush, you could look at this pie chart and say, well, it's somewhat equally distributed, meaning there's not a clear winner. It's not like the 99% and the 1% of our first chart, right? But nope. On the other hand, you see that there's a couple different things happening, areas of concentration, I guess I'll call it. But there's no getting around that almost half, 49% said we're going to reduce our plans to acquire hardware. They probably were on that kind of a trajectory already, but I think what we've seen is that the last year, and COVID in particular, has been a bit of a forcing function, an accelerant. Sometimes I like to think about silver linings, not that there's anything really that good associated with the pandemic, but if there's some positive takeaway, and in some cases, the positive takeaway is this actually gave us the impetus to go further, faster on some of the plans that we already had in place, or we thought directionally we wanted to change our infrastructure spend. We wanted to pivot more to cloud services. We began doing that earlier than we anticipated. We got results that showed that that was favorable. So it was a feedback loop to say, okay, let's go further down that path. We essentially trialed it in production.
Yeah. And let's be really clear. So I don't think either Dave or I are suggesting that this is the bellwether that tells everybody the data center is dead. That is not what we're talking about, right? In the first several months of the pandemic, you couldn't get into the building. So any IT effort was going to be either cloudy or remote access at best. And you can't light up new metal if it didn't show up on the dock. And it didn't show up on the dock even well into late Q3. I think there was press all the way into Q4. Supply chain was a problem. You couldn't get RAM. You couldn't get storage. You couldn't get the components. The people weren't going in the office, to the warehouse to build it, which means it didn't get shipped, which means you couldn't rack it. Right. So certainly there was a huge delay in anything that was data center centric. And I do think what you're seeing in that red box for those organizations that say they're going to up their 21 hardware is because they couldn't get any hardware in 20. Right. And the data center is not going away. But what we should also recognize is there's a lot of organizations, particularly those that really stomped on the gas and said, we're going to go cloudy and use this as a forcing function and said, hey, this stuff runs pretty well in the cloud. Maybe we don't need our normal year over year investments in hardware. Because remember, that's where most organizations are, right? In January, you're thinking, hey, I got a 3% bump, a 5% bump in my year over year storage budget. And what organizations are saying is, maybe I don't need to bump this year. I can do that in cloud instead. And I think that's what you're seeing is those organizations that had positive first benefits in cloud, they've said we can get away with less hardware than we originally had budgeted for. Those organizations that recognize how important the data center still is, but couldn't get metal last year, they're upping their metal because they didn't get any in H2 of 20. And I think that's how you're seeing this.
Yeah, that's right. And we've alluded to in the past episodes of Industry Insights that this we thought would feel a little like the asset management readout of the global economic meltdown of 2007, 2008, where people had to hang on to gear longer. Different reasons, but similar kind of net effect that planned refreshes, for whatever reason, either because of finances or because of supply chain, got pushed out. So some aspect of that 30% is pent-up demand for things that they already needed to actually bring it back into production. In other words, people limped along or were operationally focused, like you mentioned. Sure. I'll just reiterate what Jason said. No, this is not trying to be an indictment that the shift is on, that there's been some great pivot point. that we're now moving fully to cloud and data centers going away, particularly for larger organizations or organizations that have made a pretty significant investment. Things are not going to go away. We're going to try to get better use out of what we've deployed. Now, I've seen a couple updates. I think we're up to like 24 countries now since we last looked at the map. We also have a couple new states from the United States that have come in. We've got New Hampshire, Malta, Egypt, another cohort, Jason, in Texas. Got, I think, one or two more as well. So we're making our way across the globe here. Appreciate that. Oh, it looks like California is also in there. That, that always brings up a nice chunk of real estate, as does Mexico, if we didn't mention them earlier on.
Hey, New Hampshire's in the house. That must mean our boss is watching. So Happy New Year, Denny. Just in case. If not, welcome New Hampshire. But
exactly. So let's start to now take a look at the effects of the pandemic on digital transformation. We've had a couple pointed questions that we asked on this, and we've been focusing on digital transformation in a few of our global surveys. First question we asked was, what extent did COVID-19, the pandemic, affect or alter your digital transformation initiatives? Again, notice a very high number of global respondents, 2,800. We see kind of a whole variety of responses here, Jason, which is not a surprise because our January 2020 data, if I could use one word, I would say for most organizations, digital transformation was a continuum. Right.
Yes.
We were, as a group, as an industry, all over the map. I do want to respond to a quick comment or feedback from Matt, who mentions, from an infrastructure perspective, probably what's going on was more of an indication of cash flow and investments and resources from what he's hearing from enterprise customers. And hello from Indiana. Well, awesome. Good to have someone from Indiana. And that might be a first for us, Jason. Not recalling Indiana.
But I think Mark brings up a good point there, in that in the latter part of 2020, if you were managing cash, anything that was new expenditure, OpEx is easier than CapEx, and you can't get an appliance on OpEx, right? So yeah, they probably did say, hey, let's freeze those budgets, and then now, as we're starting to get more optimistic leaning into 21. It'd be like, okay, that box that you wanted in August, you can have it in January. Right. And so certainly that's going to see that as well. So that is absolutely a fair read. And thank you for the comment. Please keep those coming.
Yeah, well said. So if we look at the effects of COVID on digital transformation, about half, actually 54%, sped up in some fashion, either significantly or somewhat sped up their initiatives. Again, I just liken this to that K-shaped curve. Some organizations said, our way out isn't to stand still. Our way out is to go harder, to go forward. Largely, that's what this sample size of approaching 3,000 has indicated. However, 1 out of 6, roughly 16%, reported that the pandemic really didn't have an impact on their digital transformation activity.
Yeah, I like the fact that you're seeing basically the same kind of shape on a couple of these curves, that a little over half of organizations, 60%-ish, accelerated during this pattern. About 1 out of 5 organizations, 20%-ish, basically stayed the course, right? They battened down the hatches and they kept moving forward. And then roughly a third of organizations struggled. Right, either their digital transformation slowed down, their expenditures slowed down. I will do, and maybe I'm stealing my own thunder on this one, but you know how you keep talking about that K-shaped curve? I think when we talk about the cloud, I'm going to do a blog post on the Q shape, right? Because there's everything that's in the cloud, and then there's those few folks on the edge that are just hanging on for all physical data centers, right? But for everyone else, the cloud will be an increasing part of their IT strategy. So it's Q to me, not a K. But
yeah, and I like the Q because also that implies a long tail. And I think, generally what we see is that technologies and deployment models, they generally do have a longer tail than what sort of popular activity press and other things might otherwise indicate. Now, this data is showing that the shift is on, the shift is happening, in fact, accelerating. However, not to say that we're making wholesale changes means something goes to zero. So let's look at now from a digital transformation perspective, what's anticipated going forward as a result of pandemic? We asked, what if anything's did prevent your organization's ability as you kind of start to think about where do you go from here? Same kind of notion. We have last year's data, this year's data. And, let's jump to the bottom there, Jason. It's interesting in my mind that the answer of nothing is preventing us actually slightly decreased. It's only 3%, but considering world conditions, world economics, that decrease is interesting.
Yeah, and coming from Texas, all I can answer on that is, bless their hearts. If they actually, but anyway, okay, that's seems a little negative. Let's look at the rest of it, right? So yeah, you're right. So roughly 1 out of 6, 1 out of 7 organizations say nothing is holding them back. That means we can pivot that over. That means for 6 out of 7 organizations, one of these applies. And be honest, number one thing is still there's a lot of organizations out there. They're just trying to keep things running, right? So maintaining operations during the pandemic. And by the way, certainly we have seen that, healthcare workers and frontline workers have been the heroes for these last several months. I would not equate them to the same scenario, so please no flame mail. But we do want to give a nod out to all the IT folks that really had to pivot their daily jobs and change the way they do things so that the rest of the organization could remain solvent. So certainly there's those folks who are just maintaining operations, but then take a look at where the spikes are. Dependency on legacy, right? You talked earlier about keeping metal around longer. IT skills. We've talked in the past about as you're pivoting towards cloud, a lot of those skills are not as translatable. And so that's going to become more heightened. Senior management is peaked up, money and time, arguably, and senior management, all kind of, those are almost the aftershocks after dependency on legacy systems and lack of IT skills. Is that fair from your perspective?
Yeah, it is. There's such an interconnected nature to several of these. And we knew that when we designed the survey, sure. But we just wanted to see if people could pick one, what might they isolate on? And, to me, that dependency on legacy systems is frankly a little more concerning, especially if you put that in light of lack of resources like time, like money, like management buy-in. The fear would be that dependency at current course and speed becomes more of a problem 1 year from now than it is today. And I do want to recognize that Angel had a good comment saying many schools were definitely forced to catch up and long overdue. That's the kind of forcing function, some cases for better, in some cases presenting a challenge that we saw with the pandemic is that it exacerbated and or accelerated current plans and current challenges. It exposed them going forward. Jason, let's take one more look at the map, and then I'll give you last word to take us out. But I do think we've got one more major geography in the house. That is Australia, not just a portion of geography, its own continent in its own right.
There you go.
I think we're now at 26, it might be 27 different countries. Really greatly appreciate that. As we start to wind down, Jason, maybe give us a little bit of a peek about the kinds of research data that we're going to be teeing up here as we go forward in 2021 on Industry Insights.
Yeah, so there's actually like 4 other projects that we've been helming that we're going to be trying to lead with along the way. You can't be innovative in your product and your go-to-market if you don't understand where the market is going. And so we have really doubled down on how to consume that. So we have research coming out around what does IaaS at administration and architecture look like? What does containers look like? Adoption and drivers for and against SaaS. Is coming along the way. I mean, we got a lot of different stuff coming as we look towards that last generation. You offered me last word, so I want to riff off of what Angel said around schools forcing. You mentioned it as well. Certainly, the pandemic forced us to reassess IT in many ways and how to deliver our goods and services to folks. There are some things, and education's a good one, where I hope we don't go entirely back the way that we started before. Distance learning, I think, has really taken off for a lot of folks and given access to education to a lot of folks. I do think this is also a forcing function where cloud is in a lot more environments to a higher degree than one might have expected before. So in some ways, this really was forced evolution. And we shouldn't go all the way back. We should take the lessons learned and then embrace those things that we're missing and come back together again. I hope that's what 2021 is about.
Yeah, very well said. With that, we'll wrap up for today. Thank you, everyone, for joining in. Stay safe, stay positive, and we'll see you on the next Industry Insight live stream. Thank you.
Happy New Year, y'all.
Yes.